Okay, hello again to everyone. My name is Adrian Markish, and I'm the publisher and editor of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Inside Effective Business Requirements Documentation. Today's featured speaker is Keith Ellis, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Alliances for IAG Consulting. Today's session will last about 60 minutes, and there'll be also a Q&A session at the end. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the webinar software. I would also like to say thank you to IAG for sponsoring this event. At this time, I will turn over to Keith to get us started.
Thanks, Adrian. As Adrian said, I'm Keith Ellis, and I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Alliances here at IAG Consulting. And today's webinar is really getting down into nitty-gritty details. We're talking about right down in the weeds of what makes business requirements documentation effective, what makes it ineffective, what has to be there, and really what you need to make sure is not there in business requirements documentation. So it's pretty heavy lifting, and I'm delighted that I guess we've got 886 people who are joining us today, so I'm delighted that we've got as many people on the line as we can. Now, I'm also going to be sharing with you a huge amount of content. So one of the challenges with Microsoft and the GoToWebinar structure is that you don't have a 360-degree viewer that you can kind of look at all things. So, and there's a couple of places where I need to share basically the structure of requirements documentation, and as a result, I've got to use little itty-bitty tiny text. So I apologize right up front that some of you are going to be in a room with 10 or 12 people. You're going to be looking at the screen and saying, man, that is teeny tiny little text, and you're going to be, going to be annoyed at me. But anyway, it is what it is. So I'm going to run pretty much the full hour. If you do have questions, this is your opportunity to make this as interactive as you want to make it, okay? So pop the questions into the Q&A area as you go. I'll try to answer those as I go along. So Jesse, to answer your question, absolutely. If you send me an email to kls@iag.biz, I'll turn around and I'll send you the deck as well, okay? And that email address is on the first slide there, but it's also going to be on the last slide on the way through. So thanks for asking my representative question there, Jesse. As we go through here as well, the PDU information, CDU information is also on the last slide. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about how some organizations get bad requirements by design. Sometimes you can go and you can try to change, if you look at the template and you look at the process that has to exist behind that template, you realize that people are sometimes in some organizations, the only reason they're getting decent requirements is because they're hitting it so hard with a great big stick, and they're beating it really hard, and therefore you're getting okay quality. But some organizations really do get very, very bad requirements by design, and so you need to be inflexible about certain kinds of information. And what I mean by that is inflexible in terms of making sure that certain information is included, but also inflexible about making sure that certain information is always excluded from your requirements documentation. And so we need to start talking about what is in, what is out. What are some of the things that you need to think about in there? I'm going to use lots and lots of examples as I go through this, but please, what I've tried to do here is protect the innocent. So I've removed branding and I've removed a bunch of other things because somebody out there has put their heart and soul into the template that I'm going to share, or some of the different pieces of work that I'm going to share. And it is what it is, okay? So, but I don't want to be, dissing anybody's work out there. And I want to make sure that we're giving you people an actionable framework. And the idea of the actionable framework is that anybody can talk about, hey, the sky is falling, do the little chicken little thing. But let's talk about some specific things that you can take away today, take action on it, and be able to use that to move forward. So one slide on IAG. We've been at this, actually it's now 13 years, if you can believe it. And we're an organization that's dedicated to requirements definition and management. I think it's important for everybody to know where we're coming from as an organization. So this is all we do in life. And we've done something in excess of 1,200 projects, work with something like 300 of the Fortune 500 companies. And most of the time people don't call me up and say, hey, Keith, I got an easy one for you today. Usually they're calling us up because they've got 30 to 300 stakeholders, or is there something complex with the project? Sometimes it's they just don't have the internal resources to deal with it. These are the kinds of things. But it's invariably, whether we're helping companies to do projects or we're helping them to implement best practices within their organization, we're assessing the level of maturity within their organization, we're helping implement the technologies that you're seeing at the bottom of the screen, or we're looking at actually helping sometimes to outsource their organization or rebuild their overall base of competency. Any of those kinds of things, it all centers on this whole competency of requirements definition management, being able to do it well, and being able to scale it, whether you're dealing with a very small engagement that's in around $1 million, or whether you're dealing like $1 million client-side spend to build something, or whether you're dealing with very large-scale, multi-million-dollar engagements. So, one of them we're doing now has got something like 160 or 170 use cases, and it's got, more importantly, it has 150 stakeholders that need to be involved in the facilitated sessions to drive out the business requirements layer on this whole thing. And I think it's the initial documentation is something like 2,500 pages or something like that to define it. So the learning objectives, and this is stuff that I want to make sure that we're doing for people. That if you sign up to a webinar, that you make sure that you deliver on certain objectives. And if I don't deliver on it, send me your cranky email. Yeah, Lewis, the PowerPoint will be available to all attendees. Just send me an email and request it of me. The email address will be on the last slide. So the learning objectives are really to know what material must be present in a high-quality business requirement document. Not only what must be present, but what must not be present, and understand and see how documentation defects impact project performance. These are really quite big questions because you want to stop and take a look at some of the stats. And what happens if certain conditions are not met and you don't think of it doing it a certain way, but also looking at how to simplify your strategy, because oftentimes people go to a much more complex set of templates and structures, but it ends up taking them in the wrong direction. So you need to look at how you can simplify your strategy, focusing on the right kinds of information at the right time. And I'm going to initiate with a question to people, and you can pop the answer in the Q&A area. You can laugh if you've seen this before. It's your organization, but this is a real scenario. And the real scenario here, and this is because we does so much requirements where people share documentation with us all the time, and I've removed the the names of the innocent and everything like that off of here. But this is a real document sent to the IT project management office, and it was produced after weeks of effort with business stakeholders. And the expectation was that the PMO was going to provide solution alternatives. So the expectation basically by business process, the PMO had to provide solution alternatives, estimated cost, estimated total work effort to deploy this thing, and they were required by the process to deliver the requested solution. So they had to do this. And then and this was, by the way, this is not a small company. This is a Fortune 500 class company that has a multi-divisional, and this was a multi-divisional, multi-million-dollar project, okay? Now let me show you the requirements. This is it. Now I think the only irony on this is that it's a quality information system, all right? So do you see this kind of thing? Not everybody is going to see this kind of really, really abysmal quality requirements, documentation. But it does happen, and people shouldn't feel that it's limited exclusively to smaller organizations or people that are, or organizations that are entirely immature. It happens, actually, this was a very large-scale, multi-billion-dollar Fortune 500 class organization where this is happening. And it just underscores the importance of continuously being vigilant about defining for yourself what is good requirement documentation, what is not. And if you've seen this kind of thing and you've got your stories, feel free to pop them into the Q&A area and we can share them with other people as we go. So the thing is that this conference was titled Inside Effective Business Requirements Documentation. So it kind of behooves me, I guess, to use a too many syllabled word, that I answer the question, what is effective? What do I mean by that word effective? And what I mean by effective is that effective requirements documentation, or business requirements documentation, is going to have quality for sure. It has to have quality, or it is not. And quality means it is clear, accurate, and complete. And if you don't have quality, then frankly, you're wasting your time. Okay? There's no point in having any other attribute until you have clear, accurate, complete requirements. The second thing is it has to be useful. It needs to serve the intended purpose and needs of an intended audience. So if you give it to somebody, they need to be able to use it, right? It's the basic premise that's there. It has to be efficient. In other words, all of the information that that audience needs and none of the information at a particular point in time that they don't need. It needs to be efficient. All information is good information, right? But if I give you too much of the wrong information at the wrong time, it is not necessarily an efficient way to communicate. So think about those as the three base attributes of effective. Now let's talk about, and this is an example I pulled from, literally what I did is I went on to the internet and I said, okay, look, let's get the first hit of, I typed in business requirements template, and I said, okay, well, give me a template, and I looked and I grabbed the first one I could see. So I'm going to walk you through this example template, okay, and I've got a bunch of them. So I'm going to walk you through this example template. When I am done, I'm going to open up a poll, and I'm going to ask you your opinion. So be prepared for that. The opinion I'm going to ask you is, do you think this is a good business requirements template? Do you think this is a good business requirements template? In fact, factor that into that is, does this look like the one that you use internally? Because if it is, then obviously you're voting it's good, all right? So does this look like the one you're using internally? Is this a good business requirements template? Then let me just kind of fairly represent this. So the first thing they're looking for is the author, and para just means there's a space. There's a paragraph that you could stick in author or multiple authors' names. Then the review and approval, which, so basically a grid for names and dates. That was there. That was the next thing. And then scope. And now there wasn't really any definition of what they meant by scope, but they had what's the scope of the project, and they had a fairly large space that you could fill in and put a fair bit of information in. And then, give me an overview of this project and the project's objectives. So it's basically there, okay? So, and again, another paragraph where you could fill in space so you could fill in, a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs of information. Now, the next one was business requirements. And what it said is that business requirements can be provided in a spreadsheet, a flow chart, or a process model form if it is but you have to make sure that you're putting in the basic processes as 4.1, 4.11, 4.12 if you're going to list the requirements. And the next thing is it said you needed to identify the processes to be automated, and your expectation was that you'd put in a list. That's why it says list there. The technical requirements, they wanted a list, and specifically when I looked at what they meant by technical requirements, it was more the hardware, which is a list, and then the software. And when I was reading into the software categorization, they were looking at mainly configuration requirements. It was kind of what it looked like. So it's obviously a little bit of a cost bias in here. Usability requirements they were asking for, and they're looking for a list, kind of a grid structure. Functional requirements, they're looking for a list, basically data acquisition requirements, data analysis requirements, and data output requirements were the three big things that they had specifically requested in there as the subheadings of functional requirements. Security and authorization requirements, and specifically the logical and the physical. And now here's where they did a wonderful job. They had a whole lot of fidelity in this area called compliance requirements, which a series of well-defined subsections of information that they were looking for in compliance requirements, and just a whole series of activities where they obviously had this is obviously a highly regulated industry with some fairly specific things that they needed to do, and then operate and use requirements. And in this area here, when I read the titles and the categories and the descriptions underneath, they were really looking for more geographic distribution, system load requirements, system load statistics, and availability requirements, some of the non-functional stuff. And then data requirements, and let me read to you what they said, because data requirements was just basically there with a paragraph space, but they gave specific instructions. They said, please, and this is exactly what they said, please provide detailed description of data requirements, including data model for the proposed computer solution. That's what they said. The test requirements, and when I read what they're talking about was mainly user acceptance test requirements and then glossary of terms. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a poll. And what I want to know is this a good business requirements documentation, good business requirements document? In your opinion, is this good business, in your opinion? Now, by the way, the second thing is, does this look like what you're using internally? Because if it does, obviously you guys think it's good. This is what you're using, right? So is it good? Is it does it look like what you're using internally today? I'm going to answer your questions, Eve and Jan, as we go through, okay? But let me give them a couple more minutes to answer. Actually, this is interesting. I'm going to close it right there because it's exactly 50-50 with people saying, some people saying yes and some people saying no. Usually, oddly enough, when I run this webinar, the answers are about 60-70% saying, yeah, this is good. This looks like what we're doing today, and therefore it's good, or I think this is a good business requirements doc. And the reality is that I think there's a lot of flaws in this particular one. And I'm going to walk you through why I believe that there's a lot of flaws in this one and take some time, because one of the things that people often try to do, as soon as they're, they say, oh, we've got to fix the way we're doing requirements. What's the first thing people do? They say, oh, we got to improve the way we're doing business requirements in this company. The first thing people do is often what? Build a new template, right? And oftentimes what ends up happening is that you can introduce a new template and actually reduce the effectiveness of your organization. Let me walk you through why and some of the issues on this particular one. And some people are actually in the background beating me to the punch. But one of the first big mistakes in here is they're mixing business purpose. There are three independent but interdependent business processes going on at the launch state of a project. There's the corporate governance, which in governance is all about, okay, what's the benefit, the return, how are we going to manage or harvest the benefits, these kinds of things. So benefit realization is really the corporate governance layer. There's the project management, which is, the scope and the management, the entire end-to-end of the how are we executing on this. And then there's the business requirements piece, okay? The two parts of this thing, the three parts of this thing are interdependent, but they're completely separate processes. So I want to kind of point out to you what these pieces are in this particular document. What you've got here is scope. Absolutely. You have to have the scope identified in here, but be clear what scope you're referring to, because there's scope from a project management perspective, and there's scope from a business requirements perspective. And so more commonly, the scope of analysis or the scope of requirements. And you need to be very clear about which one of those two you're referring to. So to answer Jamie's question, what do I mean by the difference between these two? Scope of the project includes many things. It includes the initiation, the activities of design, development, build, test, rollout, train, all of those basic activities associated with doing the project, as well as the activities associated with managing the performance against governance and the time and cost and things like that. It's a much bigger thing versus the scope of analysis, which is really what are the business processes that we're physically looking at or that are impacted by this set of requirements. And they're two very, very different things. The objectives. Yeah, absolutely. You need to have that information. It is absolutely essential to a requirements document. The problem with this one is that they are not well articulated. You're not forcing people through saying, how do I determine if those objectives are well structured or not well structured? Because you're going to need the objectives to basically do any kind of prioritization activity. The business justification, get rid of it. This is the wrong information and from the wrong process. And so you don't need to have one document trying to cover off all angles on every aspect of a project. Pull it out. Put it into its own business casing process or something like that. It's a completely different process. The next thing you need to do is you need to think about requirements as a process. Now, here's the first thing I'm going to say, okay? I want you to rethink for a second and think about this. In fact, it's a little bit heresy, okay? And hopefully everybody's okay with this. But requirements are not a document. Requirements are a process. The result of that process is a document. The artifact of that process is a document. So if the process is lousy, how likely is it that the document coming out the back end of that process is going to be good? It's pretty unlikely, right? If the process is really good, how likely is it that the document is going to be good? It's at least reasonably probable. So I want you to do is just put the document headings on a timeline. And I want you to do this with your own internal requirements documentation, okay? Put it on your own internal and then put it in. And this is what you have. Basically what this is my pet term for this particular requirements document is 13 steps to requirements failure. All right? Because what has to happen here is the analyst has to go through basically 13 separate steps to be able to get to review and approve. Ain't going to happen. So what ends up happening is that either they're going to go through each of these in a very kind of light-winded way. So it's not well documented, but you got some information in each of these, trying to go across the entire document template, which is not a very good way to do it. Or you're going to proceed sequentially through the entire thing, but when you get to the end, something that you've got somewhere in here, like the logical data model, you could find out that you've done something wrong in the scoping area, and it radically changes something that's downstream. Yes, Lewis, it is a fishbone diagram, and it works really well when you're doing kind of the modeling of basically the sequence of a process steps. So what is effective? Does this have quality, basically clear, accurate, and complete, built into it? No, it doesn't, because what you're doing is you don't have clarity you don't have a process that's going to lead to a high-quality approach to conducting the process. The second thing is it useful? And I want to ask you something. Who is the reader? Who are we expecting to review and sign off on this thing? Because the stuff on the right is clearly, a logical data model. Give that to a business user, see what they say. They're not going to have any idea what you're talking about. The stuff on the left in here, the scope and all that sort of stuff, yeah, they're going to understand that. So who exactly are we expecting to sign off on this thing? So if you are an organization that said, yeah, this is good, and it looks like what we're using internally, I'm going to bet you guys have a problem getting sign-off on your requirements documents. Pure and simple, because the users of that information are not consistent. And is it efficient? No. You've got, I think it's Jan and Matthew were pointing out, there's a lot of other different information here. There's too much different kind of information as you go through. Yeah, sure, I can talk, Karen, to Agile requirements development and gathering. It's going to be a little bit different in terms of the kinds of things you talk about and do. Here's the next one. Critical mistake number 3 is it's missing critical information. Okay, so let's say that this was a customer order management system. All right, let's just pretend for a second it's a customer order management system. Where do you define what is a customer? Now, it could be that it's in the glossary of terms. I'm not really sure. It's possible that that's it. Or it could be it's in the data requirements. Just provide detailed description of data requirements, including data model for the proposed computer solution. Possible that it's there as well. Don't know, okay? What are the attributes of customer? And so kind of asking the question, how do I know I got a customer, right? What is the information flow underlying the process flow? Now, that, again, could be in the business requirements, maybe, right, depending on how detailed the business requirements work, the process flow elaboration is. It could be in the data requirements, not sure if it's there, right? How about who is interacting with the system? Who are the actors? Where are you putting that? Again, could be in the glossary of terms, not sure, right? Customer information is in the charter of the BRD. Good point, Rick. It could be somewhere else. We're just not sure. What variations exist for the process? If you're going to do your process like what they're saying here, it's actually going to be very, very difficult for you. Because so often when you're doing a base flow chart, it tends, or spreadsheet, right? It will tend to overlook the variations, the conditions, the business rules that drive a much more complex business process. People will tend to describe the main flow, but they'll tend not to be very good at gathering the variations and conditions that exist. What are the success conditions of your process? How do you know it was executed properly? So what you've got here is you've got user acceptance tests in a number of places. Well, how are you going to write that stuff if you don't know what the success conditions of your process are? Where are business rules being captured? We don't know, right? It could be here, it might not be here. Where are the system and process interdependencies? Don't know. And again, it might be here. The issue that I have, and the main issue, what's the meaning of paragraph? Paragraph, Valentina, just means that whoever the author was, they left a space that the user would just fill in. So I said, you just put it in paragraph format. You just answer the question in paragraph format. Okay, so the issue for me, and the main issue here, is that the use of the non-standard terms really makes it very difficult to know where information should go. And if this is a business requirements template, right? If this is a business requirements template, then we're capturing a lot of information that's probably not supposed to be here at this point in time. All right, and there's lots of ways to document requirements, but there's certain sets of information that you need to capture. And in this case here, we kind of have to agree that this particular template is not very good at helping to elaborate the objectives of the system. It doesn't touch at all on the interdependencies, okay? Helping to make sure that you're getting unambiguous goals and objectives. Uncovering interdependencies is not included in here at all. And then documenting the information required to support the process, again, kind of weak. I mean, basically saying provide detailed description of the data requirements, including the data model. You're really not going to get there very far with that. So let's look at the impact. If we have a requirements document template, all right, or requirements that are done on a project that are weak in three critical areas: uncovering interdependencies, getting unambiguous goals and objectives, and documenting the information required to support the process. If it's weak in those three areas, what you'll get from research that we did on the business analysis benchmark is a success ratio that looks like the blue chart there. So you basically ratcheted yourself into an 18.8% probability of success on a project. That's pretty low. In fact, you have basically twice as much chance of failure as you do success because of those three things. You're getting the wrong focus on the wrong kind of information at the wrong point in time. And as a result, it creates lots and lots of problems for your process. So whether you're using Agile on the back end to do your development, or whether you're using more waterfall or iterative or whatever your structure happens to be, you do need to elaborate what is it that the business wants to accomplish. And you need certain information collected or elicited from the business, all right? Or else the organization is going to be very poor in terms of its likelihood of success. And there has to be a better way to do this. So let me kind of share with you some ideas and some data. So the first thing is that success condition number one is focus on the things that affect project outcome. If you're very poor at capturing those three types of information, interdependencies, getting at unambiguous goals and objectives, or documenting the information required to support the process, you have about an 18.8% chance of success. But the big problem is that you've got this very high proportion of project failure. If you're good at that, if the requirements document template forces or enforces the correct behavior, put in things like a context diagram, right, to focus on the interdependencies of the system. Very simple techniques can be incorporated into your templates. Look what happens to your overall success likelihood or probability of success. You know what? The vast majority of projects may land in that neither successful nor unsuccessful, but you've eliminated 80% of the failures. 80% of those failed projects come off the table because of this. Again, doesn't matter whether you're using Agile or any other technique, you're still needing to write down at some level or capture or elicit at some level what does the business want to accomplish. Then you've got to go forward and look at how you're going to develop it. The next thing is understanding how, or the process of understanding requirements, okay? So, and this is different when you're dealing with Agile versus when you're dealing with more iterative requirements development. In this case here, you can't kind of think of requirements as black and white, as done, not done. Whether you're any of these methodologies, there's a tendency for people to think of requirements as done or not done, which it kind of, black and white. And the reality is people don't think that way. They don't work that way. Their brains are not wired that way. Requirements evolve. The requirements understanding evolves, and it evolves across 4 domains of information: the business process itself, the information flow required to support that process, the interdependencies of those processes with other areas of business, and the business rules that underlie those business processes. And if you are not capturing information in one of those 4 domains, you basically hamstring your ability to evolve your understanding of the entire information system and its requirements, okay? So for example, if you are only focused on the process flow and you don't go down into how do I capture interdependencies and the business requirements, you're not looking for things like, oh, I'm calling out from here to this other information system that's pulling this information. Oh, well, that's an interdependency. What information am I providing back? You're not asking the question, well, what information do I need at this particular decision point? What information do I need at that particular decision point? Those kinds of things are not coming out during the dialogue and the discussion. So the information flow is not there. And you're trying to evolve the next level, which is that high-level business requirements, and then beyond that, trying to get to detailed understanding. It's all together, and as a result of that, if you're not evolving all of those areas together, then it creates a problem for your organization. The next thing is to start talking about the detail and how you deep dive with control. And now I'm talking about much, much larger systems. Let's get away from thinking about your $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 thing, which, frankly, you can do on the back of a napkin in many cases. But let's start talking about much larger scale systems, like something that has, 150 use cases, all highly interdependent, so very, very large scale, $80 million application development activity. That kind of thing, right? You're going to evolve with, and you need to have a structure where you say, the first thing we need to do is understand a certain level of information, the high-level scenarios. What is it that you're going to interact with, the activities within those scenarios, those high-level business objects that are involved, these kinds of basic things you want to understand and get an understanding of. The next thing is that that activity level scenarios, the simple variations and conditions that exist for each one of those basic steps in the activities, right? Or basic activities that you're performing in here. From an information perspective, that next one is the high-level data flow, data definitions, the entity relationships, these other kinds of things. And then the third level might be, hey, I need the logical process model, the elaborated variations and conditions. I need the IPO, the input process output understanding for each one. The information is the logical data model, the business rules validation. These are the kinds of things, right? So as you go forward in this, you're creating a structure where, and by the way, I left the other 2 off because it would have made the text microscopic, right? But the idea is that if you evolve in a logical way and you start thinking about your documentation structure against that similar evolution, A, you can complete the documentation much, 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 much faster. B, you get better quality. And C, you get a much more iterative, adaptive, I hate to use the word agile because it's very loaded, but an agile kind of approach to developing understanding. Success criteria number 4 is you have to take into account the use of the information. Again, Mary, yes, the documentation, this will be absolutely available. All you need to do is request it of me with the, and my email address can be on the last slide. When you take into account the use of information, what you need to do is once a business requirement, the business requirements, I don't say document template, but document is delivered, you invariably need to stop, right? You need to stop and say, okay, what am I going to do with that information? Because there are many, many downstream activities that are possible. You could be building in-house, it could be a package integration thing, it could be system enhancement, there could be a showstopper in there somewhere. A showstopper is, Jerry, a showstopper is you hit something in the initial stages of doing requirements or the business requirements to say, you know what, this is a dumb idea. Or we just can't do it. It's not feasible. It's not possible. It's some other reason why you can't move forward. It could be another integration to business partners, other things. And inside each one of those areas, right? Data issue, absolutely. Inside each of those areas, there are other sub issues, right? So you could be doing this through, iterative visual development. You could be using Agile. You could be using, so like there's a number of clients we have that are using, I don't want to call it traditional requirements, but certainly a shortened requirements process that is well elaborated in front of an Agile backend. I mean, that's very typical these days. So there are a lot of different things that you've got that are different variations that you could be having downstream, right? That you either do or do not need, say, the architecture evolve. These are the kinds of things, right? You could be doing an RFP outsource stuff. So all of these are possible. And the issue is that people try to boil the ocean up front before that stop sign. They try to put too much information. Much of that information may or may not be relevant to all these downstream activities, right? If you're trying to do package integration, you don't need all of that, a bunch of that information. You really don't. It's all driven by the package. You're only going to evolve to a certain point. So what you need to do is start separating out these two things. You must include in your requirements templates all of the information necessary to the selection of the path or common to all the paths. You don't want to include the assumption of a particular path. Okay? Don't assume that you're going to take a particular path, especially if you're trying to roll out templates in a larger, more complex organization where the path is not yet determined or not necessarily determined. What you may want to do is a couple of different things. The way you evolve this is you either teach your analysts to execute with more situational awareness. You put out a template that's going to be very adaptive, but then you teach analysts what they'll call situational awareness. The second thing that we do is we build out playbooks for each of those other variations. So you've got a core, which is the template, but then you've got a playbook that you're executing depending on the subtype of project that you're dealing with. And there are a lot of effective ways of dealing with this, right? Very effective ways of dealing with this. But you can separate the two so that you're not trying to collect a bunch of bogus information. It's not bogus. All information is good, but a lot of the wrong information at the wrong time is like listening to a telemarketer tell you for 2 hours how great and wonderful, the day is, when all you really needed to know is, well, what's the offer that you're trying to give me today, right? Like, what's the thing you're trying to sell me? So success criteria number 5 is it needs to be efficient for all stakeholders, all right? It needs to be efficient for all stakeholders to make for efficient documentation. And the only way I can kind of get that across to people is provide out the things that people say about our process, right? The things that people say about our process. When you're looking at the way you do it yourself, you need to be looking at making sure that the way people integrate, the way people are working together to create the documentation is somewhat motivational. It's taking them in a direction which is positive. People are getting there faster. They're getting there more efficiently. And you're eliminating waste from the system. You're eliminating materials that should not be developed and focusing on materials that are critical, okay? So the details of our approach, let me give you some ideas about what we do, and you can choose to use those. Hopefully it thins your own approach as you go forward, okay? The first thing is, here's our basic requirements outline. So what you see from this is that it's much thinner, right? A whole lot less stuff. In the introduction, you know what, we are dealing a lot with some of the charter-related stuff. And the charter-related stuff, we have that in there because oftentimes the charter is just not done. And we're an external service organization, so we have to go in and you can't know what the state of the project is. But you are dealing with the project summary, the objectives, summary of the scope. And the summary of the scope in our case is really the scope of analysis, okay? But I'm going to go through and I'm going to blow out some of these things so you see what's different in the way that we do it. And it's a much thinner approach, but it's really focusing in on how do I get at exactly the right information that I need to be able to control and manage and evolve this. So when we talk about scope, we talk about scope from an analyst perspective. Okay, so what business processes are we really talking about? So in this particular case, it's receive a call from a customer, obtain customer information, obtain vehicle detail, et cetera, and there are certain in-scope scenarios and certain out-of-scope scenarios. So what you're trying to do is layer out and say, what are the things that are in the boundaries of what we're now talking about? And that's very helpful from many perspectives, because what it does is it also makes the physical scope of the project much easier to assess. Something that somebody's bringing you is either inside the boundaries of these basic business processes or it's not. And the way we deal with requirements are always attached to a business process somewhere. And the reason you do that is because it enables you to manage the requirements much more cleanly. If you can't manage the requirements, then you basically are losing control of your overall process. So if you can manage them more cleanly, it's because they are attached to a business process along the line. So these are the basic business processes. As we talk about interdependencies, they're absolutely critical. We use cross-functional sessions to drive out the requirements. So, we'll have as many as 40 people in a room driving out the requirements for a particular business process. And we focus on what the business wants to accomplish first. Then we drill into how we're going to accomplish it. So in here, what we're talking about is just some basic things that you could be looking for and putting into your requirements, business requirements, documents. First and foremost, just have a section for dependencies. If they're known and you can get them and they're coming out through the facilitated sessions, you're picking that up. But also have an issues list that's capturing it. So often when you're doing requirement sessions and people are creating issues, they're identifying issues as they go through, most of the time these are process or interdependent. They're getting process or functional interdependencies are getting identified. Oh, we need to talk to Bob about that. Oh, this is really the issue of sales. Or we need to check on that project and determine if the scope of that project is touching on what we're doing over here. But you got to get that picked up, because all those issues are really something that, from a project management perspective, you want to make sure you're connecting with. But more fundamental than all of this is the context diagram. Every single line on that context diagram is an interdependency. It either can be done or it can't be done. You can share information that way or you can't. See, when you're taking a large-scale project, and it's like throwing a rock into a pond, it creates ripples, right? And you don't know where those ripples are going to start touching the outside world, but you better figure it out, because each of those ripples is an interdependency. Yes, absolutely, the slides will be shared. Just send me a note, and we're going to archive it, send it out, okay? So each of these is creating its own set of interdependencies, and you need to understand what those are. If you only have a focus on the internal things that you're automating, and you're not looking outside the box to say, what is this doing in terms of touching the outside world, you'll really only have half the understanding of what you're looking for. Now here is something that the way we go about describing requirements, because what we're trying to do here is pull this from an understanding of how information is moving and the basic set of things that we're doing. So the first thing we do is we say, okay, look, we're talking about receiving a call from a customer, because that's part of what we're trying to automate, or so if there's changes or whatever it is. So give me a quick description of what that, how do you know you've got that? So what's the trigger, okay? And then you say, okay, well, what typically happens after? What are we trying to, what's the typical outcome, right? It's right here. And then what we say is, okay, when you receive a call from a customer, what are the typical things that you do? So that starts to give you your basic steps, right? What are the basic activities involved in doing that? And how does information move? So if we're talking about determining the call number, we're focusing, as we start getting into the detail, on what information is moving and how it's moving, so that you can complete this thing here. Now the requirements are very simple, right? The requirements are the gap between the current state and the future state. All right, so the use case is just helping you elaborate the business process. That's all it's doing. It's a controlled mechanism for elaborating the business process. That's all it is. The requirements are not the same as a use case. The requirements are the delta between the current state and the future state, right? And the requirements are also what is being automated versus what is a manual process. You may be defining manual processes in use case, but you're not carrying that forward into your requirements, which is the scope of automation. Okay, so you need to separate out some of those concepts. But whether you're using Agile and you're kind of defining the overall flow, right, and you're using Agile on the back end to basically drive out a larger scale application, or whether you're using more an iterative, even to some extent waterfall, you can utilize the same basic methods and practices. Although it's true, I mean, our Agile practice, for example, drives out user stories, which are very differently formatted than what we're showing you here. The capturing of business rules is a much more different thing, okay? That was what I was showing you as a business use case
Keelan, rather than a system use case. System use case can be much more component-oriented rather than the overall business process-oriented like that. It's a system use case is written from the context of the technology system itself. That's the easiest way to remember it. Business use case is written from the context of the business and how they are interacting with it. So the capturing of the business rules is much more complicated, okay? Because some of them are buried in the process description, some of them are buried in the data, the understanding of how data moves, and the data validation rules and these other kinds of things. And so you really need to have a better way of framing and capturing business rules. And this becomes much more important as you get into what I'll call detailed requirements. The more detailed your requirements get, the more important the business rules get. And the reason being is because business rules, one of the main reasons is because business rules really help you also to simplify your process description, okay? Being good at framing up and capturing business rules. But in this case here, we're talking about business requirements layer rather than really getting down into a lot more detail. Now, uncovering the information flow. The first thing that we look for is you look for the nouns, right? The system displays all the information known about the customer. Okay, so the key thing is, what is all the information known about the customer? All right, that's the key information on this one. So you got to look for the nouns. And then you record the process flow, right? You start looking at it in terms of a flow of information, and then you're going to define it. So when you want to know what is all the information known about a customer, well, all of the information known about a customer are basically this set of attributes, right? And then you do want to make sure you're carrying that forward and summarizing the relationships, because that's starting to drive out a lot of your rules and real definition of what you mean by a particular entity. Because if you don't have that, you don't really know what a customer is, because you don't know its relationship to the other objects in the business around it, right? And that creates problems for the people. Are you really talking about the same thing when you start going from the conceptual model to a logical model and et cetera on the way through? Okay? So what are important issues to consider? What is effective documentation? It has to be clear, have accuracy, and be complete. So from my perspective, you know, we can drive as IAG through the prior documentation concurrently, and oftentimes what we're doing is, if it's $1 million client-side spend on a project, we can often do what we're showing you there in 5, maybe 10 business days. We can get through to that level of detail. So you have to have quality, but it has to be useful. It needs to serve the intended purpose and needs of an intended audience. So who is the intended audience of that? Well, it's the business, right? It's business requirements. And it's efficient. You want all of the information you need, none of the information you don't need at a particular point in time. And once we determine that we're going to, say, do a design build from this, then there's a lot of other information we need, like let's go figure out the, get the, I won't say solution architecture, the reference architecture together. Does that exist? Does the solution architecture exist? Okay, fine. If those exist, now what are the pieces of this that we now need to drive down into a lot more detail so that we can start doing the components and things like that and getting into system use cases? So all that material needs to be put together. But at this point in time, is that something that is needed? And so you're architecting your requirements approach to be efficient and producing documentation that's efficient for a particular user at a particular point in time. So some closing thoughts. Requirements, and if you take nothing else away from today, requirements are first and foremost a process. It's a process. The result of that process is a set of documents, which are the artifacts of that process. But if the process is lousy, then guess what's going to happen with the requirements documentation? It's going to be lousy, right? And so oftentimes people kind of go off and try to do requirements in a box in the corner. It just doesn't work, right? If the process is lousy, the documentation quality is also going to be lousy. So you need to focus on the process. What are people doing? How are people doing it? The design, you need to design quality, usefulness, and efficiency into that process to get success. How can you improve what people are producing, how they're producing it, where they're producing it, and how efficient it is to get that done? Design that into the way you do things. And guess what? You make your process much more repeatable. This concept is not that earth-shattering. It's all from total quality management. I'm borrowing this directly from Deming. If you want a high-quality outcome called the car, you make sure that that quality is built into the way you build the car. Okay? Stick with standards that resonate, and that was my biggest issue with the prior documentation I was showing you, is that the use of very non-standard terms makes it very, very difficult to figure out what information goes where. And it's fine the first time you introduce a template because you're going to roll out a bunch of training around it, but people have this weird habit of leaving their employers and going elsewhere. So you've got to bring in other people or bring in contractors, and they're going to look at it and say, I got no idea what you're doing here. So you've all of a sudden got hundreds of people all needing to look at a document, each of which are interpreting it slightly differently. That's not a good thing, right? So you've got to start looking at shifting it. The next is simplify. Simplify, simplify, simplify. Because if you're dealing with an easier structure to work with, an easier fundamental structure, it is by its very nature far more scalable. And you can add layers of documentation later in your process. But it is by definition far more scalable on the way through. Okay, and it's adaptive because you can take that same structure and apply it to very small projects as well as apply it to very, very large projects and still drive the same level of success, right? It's simpler to execute. And then finally, execute with what I'll call situational awareness. If you know at the beginning of a project that it's very likely that this is going to be a cost initiative, commercial off the shelf, you're doing a software implementation, buy and implement, then there are certain things you do. You just need to tune and take it in a certain direction. If you are going down the path of a design build, then there are certain things you do. You take it in a slightly different direction. It's not necessarily changing your templates, but you're executing with situational awareness to understand, for example, how something's fitting within other things, to look for certain kinds of information, make sure your focus is in the right place. And you do need to teach people to execute with situational awareness. It's part of what you need to accomplish, right? It does actually, Jan, have a heading for business requirements, but I'll talk to that as we go through. Know what material must be present. So hopefully I've said what material must be present in high-quality requirements documentation. There are certain things that have to be there. There are also certain things that you really don't want there in high-quality business requirements documentation. See how the requirements documentation defects. So hopefully some of the statistics pointed out, if you're focusing on the wrong kind of information, candidly, you're setting yourself up for failure. You've got a ton of information that you're generating, but it's all the wrong kind of stuff. We were working with a client that had 3 feet, literally, of requirements documentation. It was all good stuff, but it was all the wrong kind of stuff. So it became unmanageable. The organization couldn't say whether they had or had not done, did or did not have the requirements done. Could not say whether they did or did not have the development effort done because you couldn't tie the requirements to the business process properly, right? Pure and simple. Oops, you're going to blow this thing up if you're dealing with something complicated. Again, if you're dealing with simple stuff, $500,000 development initiative even, it's not going to blow apart that bad. But if you're dealing with something that's very complicated, over $500,000, then the structure and the way you put it together has to lend itself much more toward manageability over time. You got to learn how to simplify your strategy for documentation. Focus on the right thing at the right time. And by doing that, you yield much leaner requirements documentation, far, far leaner requirements documentation. But it's far more powerful, and it's far better at helping you control the project. So some typical next steps, there's a lot of people asking for requirements templates and things like that. There's lots of good stuff on the IAG site. In fact, all of the data I shared with you, pop up on IAG.biz and grab it because it's free. There's a couple of studies there, one called the Business Analysis Benchmark. Just grab those studies and take a look at them. Start leveraging some of those assets. So there's an IAG template that you can pick up. It's a business requirements template. You can look at this, and you can, if you're interested, you may have projects that you want us to scope, or you've got some ugly ducklings sitting out there that are saying, hey, we need some help with our basic process, or this particular project, we're on iteration 9B, and we really need some help on that. Give me a call. We're in the requirements business. We've been at this for a long, 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 long time. So with that, I'm going to try to pick up as many of these questions as I can, because I got a lot of them here, in the next couple of minutes. But if I don't get to your question, then I'll try to answer it as I go through, because I do have a couple that are a little bit off. They're more agile-oriented rather than directly into what we're talking about here. But business use case system, it's definitely a business use case-oriented. Where does the current state suggest versus future state? Peter, that's a great question. What we typically do is we do both of them concurrently because most people don't have the patience for its own current state analysis. So we do them both concurrently, and the gap is, so the requirement statements are the gap between the current and the future. So what we're doing is as we're defining the future state, we are oftentimes flagging, okay, what exists today in our documentation. Now, on very large-scale projects, you sometimes can't do that. You've got to deal with the current state in terms of its system. So we oftentimes use automation to help us deal with the current state. And I don't mean reverse engineering. There's some very unique, interesting automation that's just come out that we use. And the reason why we do that is because oftentimes stakeholders don't have the patience to go through 2 iterations of doing the requirements. Okay, what about ranking requirements, prioritization? Yes, absolutely, we do that. Where we separate that out a little bit, Peter, is we do that after the requirements are done. It's a different phase. The prioritization also, you need to separate out and be clear about, when you do requirements the way we're suggesting, it's very tied to the business process. So you do need to separate out what is mandatory to the process. In other words, you just can't file a claim. I mean, it's stupid to prioritize some basic step and file a claim. You either can do it or you can't. It's kind of dumb. But there are many things that are non-mandatory functionality. So the first thing that we do is we separate those two. And from that separation, it really helps us to get clarity on the overall structure of what is absolutely essential to the business process and what's additive to that process. Are you advocating 2 documents? Yes. Typically, we structure ours out actually into 2 or 3, depending on what we're doing and how big the thing is. Because you may have a scoping activity up front that helps you build out the requirements plan, okay? Because you can't plan something if you don't know how big it is, Jan. You sometimes need a scoping activity, a charter or some other activity, which is your intake process. And then you would do business requirements, and then you would separate business requirements from either detail, and then oftentimes there may be even another level of detail beyond that. But when you use more rapid iterative approach, the basic structure of every subsequent piece of information that you're picking up, it becomes easier because you're just asking for a very specific rule or a very specific process flow or so it's very, you know exactly where that piece of information fits into your overall structure of requirements. Much easier to deal with. What does a second document look like from a template perspective? Okay, so your second document, what we are oftentimes doing is you are separating out the level of detail that you're provisioning. So your second documents, you're going to have separate documents around the architecture, which is basically your reference and solution architecture. Separate all that stuff out, just for argument's sake. Also separate out the conceptual data model, just for argument's sake. If we're just talking about the process model, then typically what you're doing is for each of those steps in your process, what you're doing is you're doing SIPOC. You're saying, what information do you need to execute on that step? How do you use that information? What do you do with that information once you get it? What's the typical outcome? So you're modeling the process at a much deeper level is really where you've got to go. And you also need to start understanding the interdependencies of different aspects of your model. You're figuring out the includes and the extends. You're basically uncovering the common functionality areas. It's called refactoring, right? So you go through a process between the first layer and the second layer. And the first layer, you really don't care what the basic structure is of some of these use cases. Somebody tells you it's file a claim. Well, who cares? Let's go look at it, okay? But when you get into it, then you understand it's got 4 or 5, maybe 10, maybe 18, maybe 20 things in it that are common across the entire structure that are common reusable components, and you got to start documenting those in a different way. So there's a lot of different things that you've got to do, and when you break it into multiple iterations like that, you're really taking it forward far faster, right? You missed 4 slides. Yeah, so missed the first 4 slides. Well, Maria, what I can do is suggest that you use my email address on the slide here and just request the slides, and I'll send it back. But really in the first 4 slides, Maria, we're talking about IAG and that we do this for a living and have done it 1,200 times or so. Can you describe briefly the differences amongst business requirements document, user requirements document? Okay, so yeah. Business requirements documents you really want to focus on, oddly enough, from the business perspective. Okay, that's fundamentally what you're trying to do. And you're trying to look at what the business wants to accomplish. As you get further and further and further along, you want to talk more about how the business is going to do this. So you're starting to move from a business perspective to a technical perspective. And that's the fundamental difference between your document types. And it's just dependent on the problem, or the approach is dependent on how your organization defines the various roles and responsibilities within the organization. And Adrian is basically asking me to do a time check, so I'll take kind of one more on the way through here. Should you structure your requirements bigger or smaller bullet points? Depends on, Tanmay, it depends on the approach that you're using. And I know that's kind of a vague way to say it, but the issue is for you is to define for yourself a methodology for how much detail is sufficient for each step. And once you've determined that, you're basically talking about the level of detail. So you've got there's basically four things. You get your level of detail, the focus of the requirements, and a series of other things. So you kind of need to define that for yourself when you're going through and dealing with this. So with that, I need to cut off because I've got like questions coming in faster than I'm answering at this point in time. So Adrian, thank you very much for the participation. Everybody else, thank you for your participation in the session today. I've got a lot of questions between now and the weekend, and I wish you all great success.
Hey Keith, thanks. Hey, I have a question for you too. I saw a number of questions regarding BPM, and I'm curious your thoughts on that. Since about make this the last one, do you have a question on the business process modeling notation for modeling
Sure.
business processes?
It's just a technique. And to me, whether you're using BPMN or you're using use cases or you're using BPMN to elaborate the use cases, it's really it's just another way of representing the same information. So we use BPMN frequently, like when we're using a tool like enterprise architecture. You're using BPMN because that's the standard that's within that tool. We were using BPMN when we're doing the current state analysis recently on our project, but it's just a way of representing business process. It's just a way of representing the business process. Where BPMN has challenges is that it's not as easy in BPMN to reference or talk to the variations and conditions that exist. So in other words, when you're inside a business process and you're in a step of a process, like you take the order could be canceled. Well, in the initial stage of going and doing the requirements, you really want to map out the kind of happy path. If you're trying to represent every single variation and condition that can exist in a BPMN diagram, sometimes the diagram gets ludicrously complex. It's too difficult to render. And so it's sometimes easier to start thinking about broadening the technique set that you have and start thinking about, okay, rules modeling and rules tables to describe certain process variations. It may be easier to start looking at saying a textual format and description. It depends on the size. It depends on the kind of project that you're dealing with. The larger the project, typically, the more strict you have to be about the way you govern the collection and the techniques that you're using in the management of information. When you're dealing with a project that's got, this one was got 160 odd use cases, that's at business requirements level, 2,600 odd pages of documentation just describing the business process. You have to be very rigid and say, we are going to use certain standards like BPMN, and we're going to continue to elaborate extensively through that because it's a little bit more rigid in terms of the way it's structured. Does that answer your question, Adrian?
Absolutely. Hey, thanks. Appreciate it being game and taking one more. That was a very good explanation. Thank you again to you, Keith, for a very informative presentation. Lots of comments from the audience on the great content. And, of course, thank you to all of you who attended this Modern Analyst webinar. Again, as Keith said, you can get the slides and the webinar. Just contact him at the email on the slide, or you can go to ModernAnalyst.com as well within a few days. Thank you again. This concludes today's event. We hope you have a fantastic day.